People, when they come to see us in clinic, are saying, what's wrong with me? What's going to happen to me? What can we do about it? That genetic profiling using AI is actually individualizing risk on the basis of genetics, but also in terms of clinical symptoms and fluid biomarkers, what have you. So I think this is this diagnostic tool, but also more importantly, prognostic tool. What's going to happen to me? Because a lot of these risk factor genes aren't necessarily making a diagnosis, but they're influencing the course of the disease that comes after that.
In this episode of Pulse, we have the great honor to welcome Professor Craig Ritchie, who joins us to explore the future of brain health. Drawing on decades of experience in psychiatry and neurodegenerative medicine, Craig shares his journey from academia to founding his own venture, Scottish Brain Sciences. We discuss how genetic profiling, entrepreneurship, and emerging technologies are reshaping healthcare. From innovation in medicine to the human impact of AI, this is a conversation about science, resilience, and the future of brain health. Sincerely hope you will enjoy this next Pulse episode. Yes, and here we are with another episode of Pulse, and this one is a special one because it's very close to where I am geographically in Aberdeen, and then even double special because we're going to talk all about the brain, which is just a continuously fascinating field. And then the last very special thing is that I'm speaking to an absolute authority on brain sciences because I have the great honor and pleasure of having with me today Professor Craig Ritchie. Professor Ritchie, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to take part today. I'm really honored to help you with this podcast.
And I promised you I would only say professor once, and then you say, please, then it's Craig after that. So I've done my professor bit.
Thank you.
So I will go right away into the Craig. And I said close to Aberdeen because you are originally from Aberdeen.
That's right. So we set up the company, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in due course, about 3 or 4 years ago. And we have an Aberdeen office. About 2 or 3 years, we opened that up. And I must admit, it was a big moment for me because I was born and brought up in Aberdeen. I went to medical school in Aberdeen. And then in my early 20s, moved to London, spent some time in Australia. So actually it was quite powerful, quite emotional to be able to, set up a branch of our company in Aberdeen. So yeah, I'm delighted to be home in many ways.
And so the company that we speak of is a great company called Scottish Brain Sciences. And I want to hear all about that. And, every time I see you here in the building, then you're on your way to the next location because there are so many locations. And indeed, you live in London and then you fly in Aberdeen and then you have got an office in Edinburgh. So it's become this entire network almost with you just traveling from one location to the other continuously. I have the idea. Is it exhausting or?
Yeah, it's a life I've kind of led for quite some time before the company was established and obviously more recently. I mean, I think, like you say, I live in London, but for 12 years, I've actually had my main business, if you like, in Edinburgh. So prior to setting up the company, I was a professor at University of Edinburgh. So I used to commute up and down literally every week between London and Edinburgh. So that travel is almost like baked into what I do now. So I think it would probably be the case that if I wasn't on a plane every 3 or 4 days, I'd probably wonder what was wrong.
So life as normal is just getting in a plane every 2 or 3
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. So let's first dive into the academic part because, that is such an amazing career in and of itself. As you said, you worked at University of Edinburgh. You were a professor. Now I want to get it right. What is the exact field you're a professor in?
Well, so today my professorship is actually the University of St Andrews, and it's quite important, and we might come back to this later. My professorship is in brain health and neurodegenerative medicine, which I almost dare say invented that term because I actually think that what we're doing in the Alzheimer space and what we're doing in brain health, in a sense, deserves to be its own medical speciality. So, I'm sure we may expand on that later. But I mean, by training, I'm actually an old age psychiatrist. But I don't really like that term for a variety of reasons. Number one is the patients we see aren't mentally ill. So that kind of deletes psychiatry. And secondly, what we're learning about these diseases are they kind of start in midlife, and a lot of the people we see are actually not old. So that deletes the old age. So I'm kind of left without a title. So
Yeah.
had to make something else up. And that was where I thought specifically brain health and neurodegenerative medicine actually fits the bill quite nicely.
Yeah. And so how does one roll into this? So take me back. When did you decide this is what I want to be and this is what I want to do?
Yeah. I, like I say, started my clinical work, my clinical training really in the mid 90s down in London at the Royal Free Stroke UCL. But I think the pivotal moment for me was I had spent 4 years in Melbourne, Australia. I'd been in my late 20s between sort of 97 and 2000. And I had the honor of working with a guy called Professor Colin Masters. And Colin is a neuropathologist, but in many ways was one of the first researchers, academics to identify amyloid in the brain and characterize it. So in many ways, amyloid is a core pathology in Alzheimer's disease. So to work with a man who discovered it was quite inspirational. He's remained a mentor ever since. And there's a lot of things I observed and learned with my patients that I was seeing there, as well as working in the academic sense that led me into this sort of clinical academic career. And I think with Colin's optimism and insights, I think even back then in the late 1990s, we really thought this was curable and that we have to find a cure for this. I mean, a cure, proper cure
Yeah.
is really what's driven me in the last sort of 20, 25 years to
Wow.
get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And then first in an academic sense, you say clinical. So you were really involved, I think, in the forefront. Am I correct to then, is that in a lab? Did you do, really do
No, so
research or?
I've never worked in a lab. I've got a huge amount of insights into fluid biomarkers, brain imaging, etc. But I'm a frontline doctor. When I do my clinical work, I see patients with cognitive concerns, brain health issues, etc. But actually, probably really since I worked in Melbourne, I would say 80, 90% of my time has been spent as an academic, as a researcher. But I think the clinical work is obviously the foundation to everything that we do. I think it would be very hard to run an academic career if you were, at a distance from hearing what patients are worried about, what their families are worried about, because it's not only the foundation for what we do, it's also the inspiration for what we do.
Yeah. So that clarifies a lot. And then, because then and I think we've had a previous conversation about that, whereby you take a leap into entrepreneurship with Scottish Brain Sciences.
Yeah.
So you jump from the academic into the venture life
Yeah.
and you mix yourself with investors and the kind of, and are very successful at it. Again, finding a cure for Alzheimer's.
The origin story, Aldo, for this is that I think, up until 4 or 5 years ago, I've been, observing in many ways what was happening to patient care across the world, not just in the UK and in Scotland, for people with, and I'm going to do air bunnies, dementia. And there's a reason I did air bunnies there, and I'll get into that later. And I was also, leading huge academic projects across Europe and globally that were really helping to define the earliest stages of disease. I was working on new diagnostics. I was working on new therapeutics. And I think the reality was that I was seeing a bigger and bigger disconnect between what we were seeing scientifically and dare say what we were even able to do clinically with, new tests and new treatments. But the disconnect was getting even greater between that and what we were offering our patients in the
Yeah.
real world.
Yeah.
So 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know what the moment was. I thought, I've been a senior academic, I've been an R&D director, I've been, clinical lead, etc. And I kind of felt that we were not really making the progress through those channels that I would have liked to make. So I thought, one more roll of the dice. I'm 57 now, 58, 57. One more roll of the dice. And I thought, well, maybe there's another vehicle for doing this, same destination, different vehicle. And that was the commercial route.
Yeah.
I was also inspired by a paper I read called the Campbell Report, which is a Scottish paper about life sciences and how you integrate healthcare with the universities, with entrepreneurship, the life sciences sector, in what we call the triple helix. When I read that before I set up the company, I actually thought that was a good roadmap. And I thought what we were missing in Scotland, indeed maybe around the world, was that kind of dedicated life sciences company that can bring different elements together, but embed them with my history as a doctor in the healthcare system, with my ongoing academic. I was joking aside. I personally was an example of the triple helix. I ran a company. I'm still a doctor, and I have a university position. So I think I kind of felt that was maybe an opportunity that we could really make a big difference by bringing those three elements together to really, make a big difference to patients.
And so what's the verdict after 5 years?
Brilliant. You and I both went to a course at MIT,
Yeah.
separately, a year or two apart, a year apart. And I remember there were so many, moments, there's so many kind of phrases that our tutors and our teachers came out with. But one of them was that, the biggest problems facing society aren't really addressed by governments or major corporations. They're dealt with by entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
recognizing the problem statement, looking at your value proposition, not sleeping for 4 years, passionately pursuing what you want to do, bringing a team around you who share the vision, and having different mechanisms for addressing the problem. I think the one thing that is clear about, a startup company, there's obviously the horrors and the terrors of, don't have to go into in too much detail,
Wobbliness. Yeah. Yeah.
wobbliness and, and what have you. But there's also the freedom to operate, even in very senior positions within the university and within the NHS. You still don't have absolute freedom to operate. Probably nor should you, to be fair, because you're working for big institutions. But if you have your own company, you do have that liberty, those degrees of freedom. So it's 4 years now. I can't say it's all been fun, but what it has been is focused on the purpose and the vision. So yeah, it's been not there yet, but we're certainly making some pretty strong strides forward.
Yeah. For the listener, it is, I think, one of the success stories here in Aberdeen, I would say, and I know it's far bigger than that because you also have an office in Edinburgh and then I believe elsewhere in the world as well, right?
We haven't really gone, made a big song and dance about it yet, but we have an office in Fresno in California, and
Yeah.
we're just ramping that up to do
Yeah.
what we've been doing in Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and then we've got a lab in St Andrews in their incubator space, and then there's plans, of course, to. I guess one of the other things about working in a company is that you're not bounded by geography.
Yeah.
So, university or a healthcare system is pretty much bounded by where it's based, whereas we're at liberty to go anywhere in the world. That's very important because of Alzheimer's, of course, is a global problem. It's not just a Scottish problem.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of you've already outgrown almost your name, right? It's Scottish Brain Sciences where it's where you started, but it's not where you stop, essentially, right? You're growing far beyond that. That was the point that I wanted to make. Like, well, your expertise and your approach and everything you do here is something that can be learned from on a global level, and it shows. I mean, it's getting traction. So, congrats for that alone. And it's a massive exercise in just 4 years. Because 4 years isn't that long if you think about it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, we're not changing the name when we work in California. We will still be Scottish Brain Sciences. I think Scotland isn't a bad brand. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is that, in some ways, yes, I set up a company 4 years ago, but there's a lot of momentum in my career already.
Yeah.
So, for instance, setting up an office in Melbourne is quite low hanging fruit because I worked there for 4 years and I've continued my academic associations and the outputs are still visible, if you like, to the communities that we're going to be engaging with. Although it sounds like, we started 4 years ago as a startup, we actually started 30 years ago. um,
Yeah.
and many of the people who actually work for Scottish Brain Sciences we've worked together for 10, 15 years actually. So that family that we've built over the years of researchers and engagement officers and whatever I've joined the happy ship. So yeah.
Yeah. So I've got two questions. So who is your client? So is your client, are these individual patients or are you working with hospitals, or could you just talk me very quickly through what your
You know,
product
that's
and
a,
your
that's absolutely brilliant question, because one of the things that we realized is we've actually got two customer bases. So, when we talk about who's our customer, it's almost like Janus. We look left and right at the same time. Our most important customer, and I don't like to call them customers, is actually the public, because we do clinical research, we do cohort studies, we do diagnostic studies, we do clinical trials. And all those things require having people, patients, participants. So we need to make sure that we are offering something which is of value to them. There's a value proposition, if you like, to the public, and we can go into that in more detail if you like. But of course, our customers are, dare say, the people who pay for our services, and that's never going to be the patient, by the way. So we don't do anything that gets any revenue from patients. So that's the pharmaceutical industry and the med tech industry. So in a sense, we've got this kind of, we almost have this, requirement within the company to have two teams. One focuses on the public and the other focuses on the corporate. And, bridging between the two is quite straightforward in many ways. So our customers are the public and our customers are, but the value proposition is obviously different to both.
and by the public, so is that, am I correct to assume, is that then, because you said it's not an individual patient, is it like the NHS or their
No,
government?
sorry, it is individual patients.
Okay.
We core to the business is something, we have our own cohort study called Iona, named after
Okay.
the island off the west coast of
Yeah.
Scotland. And in that cohort study, today we've got about 750 people. So those are the people, 300 are in the Aberdeen Centre. The rest are in our Edinburgh Centre here at Murrayfield Stadium. And why they get involved is, number one, they get really good assessment of their brain health. And as a consequence, they might get feedback and advice about brain health, not in a clinical setting, but just your results are abnormal and we should, maybe speak to your GP about these things. They also then get the opportunity, if they're eligible, to come into to drug trials, because I think that's a lot of their hope, is that by being involved in research, they will make things better for the next generation. It's very altruistic. And there also might be some benefit for them personally if being involved in a trial gets them, onto cutting edge medicines. From our perspective, what we do is we take blood and we take, collect data from them. And that is what we can then pass on to industry. So industry is looking for these data and these biosamples and what have you. So that's one revenue stream. And the other revenue stream is if people do come into a clinical trial, the sponsor, the drug company, will pay us to deliver it. So that business model allows us to make revenue from industry partners and allows us for free to see patients.
Yeah. To help them. Okay. Yeah. Now it's clear. Yeah. The other question that I had is, you said like you've had many hats on and in a thriving career on many levels, all with the same topic. And that might be hard, but is there kind of one differentiator between being an academic and being a businessman? And if so, which one would that be? What's the biggest difference for you?
In many ways, I still am an academic because I have a post at St Andrews University and I've also got an honorary chair in Aberdeen. So I'm still, I'm still holding grants, I'm still publishing, etc. I think it's important because I think actually the one thing that, although I'm not answering your question directly, I think the one thing about Scottish Brain Sciences that makes it different from many other CROs, clinical research organizations, is that academic foundation. The fact that we, are still researching, publishing, what have you. We've got a conference coming up that we're hosting, International Brain Health Conference. So we're not leaving behind our academic foundation. In fact, we're probably continuing to build in it and thrive because of that. But I think if on a day-to-day basis, how was my life 5 years ago when I was a university professor and how is it today where my primary role is CEO and founder? My immediate reaction is actually, dare I say it, security. I mean, I think when you work for a university as a professor, you've essentially got a job for life. And that's, great at a personal level.
Yeah.
But in some ways, and I don't want to be sort of negative about this, but that security can actually work against drive and innovation because you don't have to,
Yeah.
to be
Yeah. Yeah.
perfectly blunt. Whereas if you take your foot off the gas as a CEO and founder of a startup,
Yeah. It's
you're
gone
going to
down.
crash.
Yeah.
So I think it's liberating being a CEO and a founder, but it's probably also more exhausting
Yeah.
because you just don't have that safety net that you have
Yeah.
if you're in, in a public position. So, but I wouldn't change it for the world. I mean, I
Yeah.
think the impact we're having already is tangible, and that's what fuels you.
That's what you're doing it for. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. 100%. And to be fair, what you're saying also applies to people who have a steady corporate job, right? So I
exactly.
think comfort zone, it's not necessarily in research. It's not only for that. I appreciate that there's tenure or those things, but I also had a decade long career working for big corporates, and I just couldn't help myself and wanted to start my own company.
Mhm.
And here I am 14 years later, right? And it hasn't been all the time rosy, but when it's success, it's your success. And it's true, you have a drive. It's almost a top sport. That's what my wife says. She kind of says, like, well, you're doing, every single day, you need to present yourself and go at it and make sure you get the most out of it. Otherwise it'll fall apart. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think the other thing that is very different is, I often say that research is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So you get the grant, you spend years either working in a lab, getting the data, or in my case, the cohort studies or the trials. You then publish the data, and that whole journey from the grant to the experiment being run to the publication of the paper can be years. And then often what happens is the publication just dare say, just sits there,
Yeah.
and you kind of hope that guidelines will be written or a meta-analysis will be done, or the healthcare system will pick it up. But to be fair, if you actually look at this, the time spent between research findings being secured and implementation in health systems is usually between 10 to 15 years. So that's, again, from the company's perspective, that should be 10 to 15 minutes. And it's seriously, and that's our kind of, if we do something and we find a solution, we want to be almost like, I mean, the term is obviously you build the plane while you're flying it. So you want to have this kind of, cycle of research evidence getting into practice and being evolved. Now, I say that, of course, the most important thing is that plane, when you're building it, as you're flying it, isn't going to crash. You can't be maverick. You've got to be careful. You,
Yeah.
you, you can be bold,
Yeah.
but you can't be, careless. So I think that's again something with SBS that we're allowed to close that loop. So it's not a linear translation, stepping. It's more circular. So that's what, again, and by stepping out of the NHS and the university, I'm allowed to control that cycle. Uh,
Yeah.
so,
And that sounds like a big advantage because I've, countless of times I've had conversations with people who say that, either academia or government, it's so slow. The decision-making cycles or like, whatever it takes to gear something up to have an actual impact takes years and years and years. And it doesn't necessarily sync up with how it works within corporations, how quick you try to push something out. And yet you need each other, right? And I think in this day and age, which is kind of the next topic I want to dive into with you, when you look at technology and AI and the changes that is being brought into these worlds so quickly, we need to wonder, like, should one not go faster or maybe the other one slower? It's either or, right? Because it's mainly companies who produce AI and technology, and they bring it into this world, and looking at, okay, how do we adapt almost? So I think there's a bit of a turn there. But
yeah, and I think the speed or the velocity of these changes should actually be set by the speed and the velocity of the diseases, and also the speed and the velocity of the public
yeah,
be able to accommodate and accept innovation. I think what's absolutely true and has been written about for decades is that major healthcare providers are kind of invested in the status quo. I'm often struck by the term people say that, what we're doing in SBS is really disruptive. And I'm actually saying, well, it depends on your perspective, because from the public's perspective, it's actually really constructive. It's not disruptive at all. And saying something's disruptive, I think, is a kind of a criticism which is unfounded. I don't like that term being called a disruptor because it says, well, so what I'm trying to do is actually break the status quo, which everyone knows isn't working. Why does that make it sound like I'm doing something special? And I think the other issue about big healthcare systems or big institutions is it's really hard for innovation to take hold. I think if you think about, the what's it called, the Rogers Everett curves of diffusion of innovation,
Mhm.
you basically have the innovators, early adopters, etc., right the way through to the late majority and the laggards. And in many ways, if you're a big institution, you've got a very low risk appetite, and you probably don't have the resources, particularly in the NHS, to really accommodate innovation. And unfortunately, those healthcare systems are, I'm not saying they have a monopoly, but they're certainly, where most people receive their healthcare.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're trying to do with Scottish Brain Sciences is be at that innovative early adopter stage where we have got a higher risk appetite and we have got the resources, human and financial, to be able to take those innovations forward. And the one thing I say quite often is that what we're trying to do is demonstrate the art of the possible so that you move through that innovation journey with evidence that you're actually effective and also safe, which is more important than effective. And I think that's what we're working on. It's almost like, sounds a bit sort of almost egocentric, but we're actually trying to create a new healthcare system that demonstrates the art of the possible. And then the major healthcare systems can adopt it more seamlessly.
It's fascinating because I think many entrepreneurs, when they start their journey, it's often kind of they have voiced their protest, and they've kind of put that into a venture to attack the system as is. Whereas it sounds like you're a lot more someone who knows the system from the other side very well and has built something just to improve it, not
Yeah,
necessarily to protest kind of what's
that's,
ongoing, just to say, hey,
yeah,
here's one way how to do it better, right? So it's a great way.
absolutely, Aldo. I mean, I think you've said something very, very insightful. I mean, as I mentioned before, I've been an R&D director, I'm a senior professor, I've run drug trials and everything. So one could even argue that my fingerprints are all over the previous system. So it'd be a bit disingenuous of me to then sort of shout about it and then dare say it. Yeah, shout about it, but then do something about it.
Yeah,
And I think the thing that again from an entrepreneurship perspective is I've been in the room listening to the problem statements, plural, for
yeah,
20 years.
yeah,
So if you want to, create your value proposition, the most important thing is having insight to the customer's problems. And I've lived that literally every day for 20 years. So I think what setting up Scottish Brain Sciences did was give me an ability to address those problems, which I've actually been I'm part of the problem in many ways, flipping things around to then be the solution. I think that's also why, healthcare systems, NHS, the universities aren't antagonistic to what we're doing. They're
yeah.
partnering it because they
We
actually
embraced it.
they
Yeah,
embrace it because they say,
yeah,
well, it's not a threat.
yeah,
This company is not trying to, do something, untoward. Their motivation is exactly the same as ours,
yeah,
but they've got the capacity to maybe do things a bit more quickly. So Scottish government, the life sciences sector in Scotland, when we had our building opening in Aberdeen, Richard Lochhead was there to. We had it opened by a participant, but he was there giving a few words. So we're not on the outside. Oh, we're part of that triple helix.
yeah. That's amazing. Let's dive into AI.
Of
Friend
course.
or
Sorry.
foe?
Yeah.
Are you friend or foe of AI?
Friend. I mean, I think well, it's not a binary.
No,
It's
I
not black
know, I
and
know.
white. But I'm sitting here as probably somebody who's an end user rather than necessarily having great insights from a sort of technical perspective about its potential, etc. But I think, I said earlier, when you set up a company, you have to have a high risk appetite. You have to have a tolerance of accepting innovation and leaning into new development. So I think from a personality perspective, entrepreneurs are probably more likely to see the benefits of new ideas than necessarily the risks. So I think, my default position is to see, well, how can we use these new technologies for the betterment of humankind? And I think, you look at the history of innovation over hundreds of years, there's always going to be a negative reaction to new technologies. I mean, when cars were first produced, everyone was saying, everyone's going to, you had to walk, you probably know you had to walk in front of a car with a red flag when they first were, produced in the turn of the century because, and they often wondered the human body couldn't go over 6 miles an hour or it would explode. So I think there's always going to be the cautionary tales about new technologies, but I think invariably humankind overcomes those and
Yeah.
actually the new technologies actually end up almost entirely working for benefit rather than for detriment. So yeah, I think we're in that learning space.
It
So
reminds me of, I don't know if that was at MIT again that I saw that, but that you had teachers protesting when the calculator was introduced.
exactly, that's
Because
another
they
great
said, this
example.
is the end of teaching because
Yeah.
now kids are not gonna remember numbers because a calculator will do everything, and that never happened really,
Well,
right?
I,
So
I there was a few things in the press 5 years ago. We actually published some papers about visuospatial function being a very early problem with in Alzheimer's, because of the effect on the hippocampus. And there was some commentary about the GPS causes Alzheimer's
uh,
because you no longer use your brain to find your way around. We're all going to be so reliant on GPS that we'll never be able to use our brains again. That's going to happen, and that's fine. It's a big news story, but
yeah,
reality, common sense tends to prevail. So
yeah, but that's an interesting one though. I mean, not to linger on GPS or calculators or red flags for cars, but I'd be interested to know a little bit more about the adaptability of the human brain when it comes to when new tools or technology are being introduced. So I was at a conference last week, and there was a Princeton professor, and she spoke about how we humanize certain tools. And she said, like, well, we'd be maybe wrong to humanize AI. I know this is maybe not necessarily adaptability of the brain, but I think it's interesting that we think, oh, it's going to reason like a human being, but then at the same time, it isn't. And I think it has a capacity to process and a capacity to, at some point, make decisions or generate output. I don't know. It speaks about how do we adapt against that, and are we capable? Is the human brain capable of doing that? And I'm with you that we will adapt. It's more like how, right? It's kind of how do we figure that out?
yeah, I mean, I think
Speaking, sorry,
no, no, I get. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, and we're
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about the brain being able to adapt, or the person being able to adapt to new technologies, and I think I'm probably going to get this wrong, but humankind's only been around for tens of thousands of years, and in the last millennia, think how much advancement there's been from where we were in the ninth, 10th century to where we are today in terms of technology. Now, I remember reading somewhere that there was mathematicians in Greece, 2,000 years ago, who were basically, almost describing Newtonian physics with the capacity to describe all sorts of different elements. There was obviously an issue then in what we call the Dark Ages, where science was seen as evil. But if you look at the journey of innovation over the last maybe 3,000 years, this has been able to manage quite a bit,
yeah,
and we're not necessarily failing as an
yeah,
organism because of
yeah,
the things that we've been able to create for ourselves. So
yeah,
I don't know if there's a plateau or if there's a cliff edge we're about to fall
yeah.
off,
We know.
but
Yeah.
history suggests we'll probably be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
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 I think the other thing about AI, I mean, it's an interesting term, artificial intelligence, because it kind of implies that what AI does currently, which is basically review a big database that we don't have access to between our ears and comes out with solutions or interpretations, is all that we mean by intelligence. And intelligence is emotional intelligence, it's societal intelligence, it's community intelligence. There's so many things that we do as humans, which AI is not artificial on at all. It can't get there. It can't walk up a mountain and smell a beautiful meadow and fall in love. There's
Yeah.
so many things that they're limited by and will always be limited by, that they will remain a tool for us rather than vice versa.
Yeah. That's a great way of looking at it. I'd be interested in maybe those things that you've seen in your research. So we've spoken before because one thing I'm passionate about as a father of a now almost 7 years old is screens,
Hmm.
right? And I think we live in this day and age where everything's on a screen. We have our phones, we've got our desktops, we've got, 1,001 things, and our kids are imitating us, and they also have screens. And what you see on the screens is social media and loads of things that I don't think are very good for us. As someone slightly closer to the brain than I am, do you have any findings, or maybe nothing? Fair enough. That we shouldn't be so screen immersed. Are we too screen immersed in our day to day life?
Yeah.
And yeah,
No, I think it's a really, we've segued from AI into screen time. And I think AI in a way is just a tool. It's something that we can use in our workplace. We look in our homes to, I come back to speed. It will help us do things more efficiently. It'll give us some time back.
yeah,
Um, and I very deliberately mentioned that the human is at its best when it's, walking in the hills, swimming in the sea, going out for dinner with friends, all the things. I mean, I could list things that are important to me. And of course, if people listening, there'll be other things that are important to them. And I think what screen time does for kids is actually stops them getting into those environments. If you're spending your time, looking at a tablet and, looking at social media, there's not just the content, which could be disruptive because it's unreal, to be fair. It's outside your village. We are best when we're actually with people in communities, those global communities of influencers. They're not your village, and that's a problem. Too much information for young kids who can't manage the distinction between who's nearby socially and who's at a distance and has no concern for who you are or what you do or what you read. So I think the content is a problem. But then I also think there's just that zombification of kids just looking at the screen almost, how many hours a day I can. Because when they're doing that, they're not doing something else.
yeah,
And it's those something else, the walks in
that
the
they should be
park,
doing.
going out. I mean, I think Aldo, I'm slightly older than you, but but
That.
when
Yeah,
I
yeah,
when I was in my 8, 9, 10 years old, how did I spend my evenings? How did I spend my weekends? It was running around the park with my friends playing football, or going out on our bikes for journeys into the countryside.
and yeah,
Um, and I'm not saying that my generation's perfect, far from it, but we learned those social skills by metaphorically falling off our bike
yeah,
and getting up and learning and going again. If you live in this controlled environment on a screen, you don't have those same experiences. And we don't know what the next generation of kids are going to be like as adults.
yeah.
I really think this is probably one of those technologies, is by what I was saying earlier, because it's being used so prevalently by people who can't consent, children. And I think, it's one thing for an adult to say, well, I'm going to sit in front of a TV for 12 hours a day. That's their choice. I think
Yeah.
we're taking that choice away from children by the availability of iPhones, iPads, computer screens, Netflix. I think it's just intuitive common sense that that's not going to be a good thing for them in the long run.
I like what you say is like it prevents us from doing the things we need to be doing to have a healthy development of our brain, which is be
And
with
our,
your
and our
village.
body and our
Yeah,
physical
our
state as
body,
well.
yeah, all connected in a way,
Yeah.
and actually the screen prevents us from doing so. At the same time, so what I also hear you saying, like a screen per se isn't the worst of the worst. Because, for instance, my 7-year-old goes to school in the morning. She needs to select her lunch because you don't have the blackboards anymore. These are whiteboards. These are screens, right? So, but she's with her group and she just selects. So the interactivity is also screen induced, which is, I think, something very different than watching Netflix 12 hours, right? So screens are ever present. So like if I check in the building, I also have a screen, right? Sign in, sign out. So we use screens on many levels, right? But that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just automation of our lives
Yeah.
to crack on with the things that are good for us.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things that when I, tried to pull some threads together, when I started the company and, I was offered a whole bunch of mentorship, some of which was good, some of it not so good. But one of my mentors back in the day, or advisors, if you like, said, the most important thing for a CEO is three things: freedom to operate, rhythm, and balance. And I think what you were just describing is, if you think about screens, yes, of course, there's value in screens for things you've described. I mean, look at us now. We're looking at a screen. We're doing something now which involves technology and,
Yeah.
but it's balance.
Yeah.
It's finding the time to get away from that. And you could debate whether screens and social media have elements of addiction within them and the way they're presented and the way that that's done. But what it does is it removes that balance. And I think that balance, that homeostasis, that rhythm that we have naturally in our lives is being disrupted by screens. And also strong evidence that screen time before bed is really disruptive to sleep. So you're having a tool which is fundamentally helpful in many different walks of life, but is also got a negative consequence. And the challenge is how do you not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think there's a very different issue here with the kids, and I think they do need to be some controls in place to make sure that they're getting that,
That I
maintaining
get
that balance in their lives.
100%, and we're fighting the fight with other initiatives and alternatives. But it's very good. I like the word balance, and I think you're very right. That's what we need to aim for. And yeah, make sure. I think it also feels like make sure there's an adult in the room, there's a parent in the room who oversees that balance for people who cannot consent yet, right? We have the responsibility to make sure our kids don't overdo it with the screens.
Well, and I think the other thing that is really interesting is, I saw a cartoon the other day where, I think it was, it was a cartoon. I think it was a mother or a father walking down the street smoking a cigarette, and
Yeah.
the kids walking behind smoking a cigarette.
Ugh.
So, if you are trying to be in the, just when you immediately said, if you're in the room with a kid and monitoring, the best way to do is probably not be on your own screen, you
Yeah.
know? and and I see
Yeah.
that all the time. People like saying,
Don't be honest.
don't
Yeah.
use your screens, as they're
Yeah.
using the screen. So it's modeling. You need to make sure that
Yeah.
you are literally practicing what you preach. And I think I'd like to think of, if my kids were growing up, they're a bit older than yours, that we used to have a screen-free Sunday, and it wasn't as prevalent then anyway. Because we didn't have the TV on and we didn't have any screen time, and it was actually probably harder for me and my wife to go screen free than it was for the kids, because we were getting so
Yeah,
used.
yeah. No, but I think that's for many parents these days because, I mean, yes, of course, I get it. Like your kid will imitate you if you're on the phone. At the same time, many parents are on the phone not because they're on social media, but they need that to survive economically, right?
Check
So
emails
and
and
with the screens, you're trying to do 9 to 5, and then you put it away. But in practice, it's, quick email or quick message or getting back to someone, and that's also screen. So whilst you're looking at the screen, so there's a tension there for many parents, as you said. Like I think my wife and I struggle because we're like, just this one email or just this one message or this one meeting or this one thing, and that's a screen, and our child sees that. So, but
it's very, very
it's
intrusive.
it's
Yeah.
yeah. So that there's a tension there, and but we're not going to solve that in this in this conversation. But it's interesting just to take a quick look at. I'd be amiss. I have one last question before I have my two very last questions, which are standard for each episode. And I'm very conscious of your time. Thank you so much, Greg. I'd be amiss as the CEO also of Genomes.io, whereby we look at genetic data, if I wouldn't ask you about Alzheimer's or deterioration of your brain and genetic susceptibility. And I know this is a very big question, and again, but I'd be interested because I recall a few years back I was approached by an organization, and they were looking into a case of severe Alzheimer's that they suspected was in Mexico, of a group of people who genetically were predisposed for this a lot more than other people were. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. Like, is it indeed genetic? Are certain people kind of a lot more predisposed to Alzheimer's than others, or is that a myth? Yeah.
Well, there's two parts to this. I mean, number one is there are rare types of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias which are, fully penetrant, autosomal dominant, genetic risks. So mutations in presynuclein 1, presynuclein 2, and APP, for instance, in Alzheimer's. So those people, unfortunately, if they carry the gene, are going to get Alzheimer's. It's a fully penetrant genetic risk. The second is there are risk factor genes like apolipoprotein E. So if you carry the E4 allele, you're 3 times the risk. If you're homozygous, you're 14 times the risk. There are both, deterministic genes as well as probabilistic genes for Alzheimer's. And the phenotype or the clinical presentation is different. It's younger when there's a fully penetrant risk. But I think one of the things in this is that we know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. And I think there's inevitably going to be other genes that are involved in your risk of dementia. So when you do GWAS studies, a lot of the risk factor genes that come out are actually related to neuroinflammation. And this is going back to our AI discussions. People, when they come to see us in clinic, are saying, what's wrong with me? What's going to happen to me? And what can we do about it? And in some ways, that genetic profiling using AI, because obviously there's a lot of genes in your DNA. It would be impossible to do this with a calculator. This is where AI would come into its own. Is actually sort of individualizing risk on the basis of genetics, but also in terms of clinical symptoms and fluid biomarkers, what have you. So I think this is this diagnostic tool, but also more importantly, prognostic tool. What's going to happen to me? Because a lot of these risk factor genes aren't necessarily making a diagnosis, but they're influencing the course of the disease that comes after that. So I think we're in the foothills of understanding how best to use genetics in clinical practice in this area. At the end of the day, the other side of the equation, of course, is therapeutics. And I think what you can do is if you can find therapeutics that can address these genetic manifestations, if you like, then you've moved the dial significantly. I mean, for instance, when I said that a lot of the GWAS studies have found neuroinflammation as a genetic influences on inflammation. Guess what that did? That opened up a whole bunch of avenues for therapeutics or anti-inflammatory. Because wow, there's something going on here. So the genetics not only can be used at an individual level for treatments and prognosis, but they can also be used at a scientific level to refocus energy to different pathways that are relevant for brain health.
So the more we know about the gene, the more hopefully solutions can present.
Knowledge is power. Who knew?
Yeah. Knowledge is power, most definitely. Then for my 2 very last questions, and one question, this is just my own personal amateur research into morning routines. And so I ask every guest on the show, do you have a morning routine? And if so, do you care to share?
I travel so much, and this is going to come up so badly, but I seem to wake up in a different bed every morning. That's only So I think
that's also a routine then, almost.
I think the one thing that I would not survive the day is that first cup of coffee. I have a cup of coffee before I have a shower, and I also wear contact lens in one eye. I've got a cataract that got recovered in the other, but I was told by my ophthalmologist that I wasn't allowed to put my contact lens in before the shower. So it's coffee, shower, put my lens in. That's what keeps me sane.
Yeah. And that sounds like a very solid one, and then you kind of tune into what the day is going to bring you. And for you, it's like, okay, which country am I at?
That bit.
I remember because I used to travel a lot as well. And then sometimes there's this confusion, like, where am I? That you wake up and you're like, oh, yeah, I'm here today.
As you get older, that length of time to work out where you are actually gets longer. It used to be seconds. Now it's a few more seconds.
A few more seconds. Like, yeah. And then my last question is about reading. You've had such an amazing career, and it's obviously now what you're doing now with Scottish Brain Sciences. In your path, has there been any kind of, maybe in the beginning of your journey or midway through your journey, has there been any reading that has inspired you? So for people who are listening and say, oh, I aspire to have a career like Professor Craig Ritchie. Has there been any reading on your path that you feel that has inspired you and that you would recommend to others?
Well, I think I find it very hard to read books about my subject area. Even things like, Still Alice, movies like that. I kind of avoid that. I actually really enjoy the great American classics. I've read everything by Steinbeck. I visited the Steinbeck Museum in Salinas, California. I make a pilgrimage there if you like, because I think a lot of what we are in life is actually bound up in our culture and our history. And I think reading in many ways, I think this was in Good Will Hunting, it helps us to realize we're not alone.
Yeah.
So, this sense of reading great literature from, amazing authors, and you go, wow, I get that. I understand that. I feel that is really grounding. The one book that's probably been the most inspirational in my life is The Grapes of Wrath. I probably read it 4 times. I think if you were to read that and listen to the challenges, in the Great Depression and how, the Joad family overcame those to a certain degree, it can be very inspiring. And unfortunately, history is repeating itself. So I think if there was one book that's probably been a kind of a cornerstone of the way I approach life, it's The Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah. Well, I just have one new recommendation for my summer reading list. I'm going to right away. That's a great recommendation. And I like it that you say, well, I don't necessarily read in my academic field. It's like, yeah, it's been a wonderful interview. Thank you so
Thanks,
much
Al.
for doing. Little call to action, the conference, because I know that's soon in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
When is it? Could you?
So the 18th and 19th of May,
18th
IBHC,
and 19th. Yeah.
IBHC 26, International
Yeah.
Brain Health Conference. I think when this goes out, we might have closed the registration, but there will be an International Brain Health Conference 27 next year. So yeah, look out for that. The other call to action is for anybody listening to this is, believe that we can cure Alzheimer's, because I think there's so much pessimism and so much negativity around this topic, but actually a cure is just around the corner, but we have to believe it's possible.
We have to believe it is possible. On that note, thank you so much for your time, Professor Craig Ritchie of Scottish Brain Sciences.
Thanks, Aldo.
You've listened to Pulse by Alpha Wire, produced by Natalie Piles and Amela Faisal, with great music, The Optimist, written by Holly Hamill, performed and produced by ALO. Episodes hosted weekly by me, Aldo de Pape.